Gormenghast. Chapter 4. One summer morning of bland air, the huge, corroded bell-like heart of Gormenghast was half asleep, and there appeared to be no reverberation from its muffled thudding. In a hall of plaster walls, the silence yawned. Nailed above a doorway of this hall, a helmet or casque, red with rust, gave forth into the stillness a sandy and fluttering sound, and a moment later the bleak of a jackdaw was thrust through an eye-slit and withdrawn. The plaster walls arose on every side into a dusky and apparently ceilingless gloom, lit only by a high solitary window. The warm light that found its way through the web-choked glass of this window gave hint of galleries yet further above, but no suggestion of doors beyond, nor any indication of how these galleries could be reached. From this high window a few rays of sunlight, like copper wires, were strung steeply and diagonally across the hall, each one terminating in its amber pool of dust on the floorboards. A spider lowered itself, fathom by fathom, on a perilous length of thread, and was suddenly transfixed in the path of a sunbeam, and, for an instant, was a thing of radiant gold. There was no sound, and then, as though timed to break the tension, the high window was swung open, and the sunbeams were blotted out, for a hand was thrust through, and a bell was shaken. Almost at once there was a sound of footsteps, and a moment later a dozen doors were opening and shutting, and the hall was thronged with the criss-crossing of figures. The bell ceased clanging. The hand was withdrawn, and the figures were gone. There was no sign that any living thing had ever moved or breathed between the plaster walls, or that the many doors had ever opened, save that a small whitish flower lay in the dust beneath the rusting helmet, and that a door was swinging gently to and fro. As it swung, broken glimpses were obtained of a whitewashed corridor that wound in so slow and ample a curve that by the time the right-hand wall had disappeared from view, the roof of the passageway appeared no more than the height of an ankle from the ground. This long, narrowing, ash-white perspective, curving with the effortless ease of a gull in air, was suddenly the setting for action. For something, hardly distinguishable as a horse and rider until it had cantered a full third of the long curve to the deserted hall, was rapidly approaching. The sharp clacking of hoofs was all at once immediately behind the swinging door, which was pushed wide by the nose of a small grey pony. Titus sat astride. He was dressed in the coarse, loosely-fitting garments that were worn by the castle children. For the first 9 years of his life, the heir to the earldom was made to mix with and attempt to understand the ways of the lower orders. On his 15th birthday, such friendships as he had struck would have to cease. His demeanour would have to change, and a more austere and selective relationship with the personnel of the castle would take its place. But it was a tradition that in the early years the child of the family must, for certain hours at least, of every day, be as the less exalted children, feed with them, sleep in their dormitories, attend with them the classes of the professors, and join in the various time-honoured games and observances like any other minor. Yet, for all that, Titus was conscious of always being watched, of a discrepancy in the attitude of the officials, and even at times of the boys. He was too young to understand the implications of his status, but old enough to sense its uniqueness. Once a week, before the morning classes, he was allowed to ride his grey horse for an hour beneath the high southern walls, where the early sun would send its fantastic shadow careering along the tall stones at his side. And when he waved his arm, his shadow self on a shadow horse would wave its huge shadow arm as they galloped together. But today, instead of trotting away to his beloved southern wall, he had, in a moment of devilment, turned his horse through a moss-black arch and into the castle itself. In the still silence, his heart beat rapidly as he clattered along the stone corridors he had never seen before. He knew that it would not be worth his while to take French leave of the morning classes, for he had been locked up more than once during the long summer evenings for such acts of disobedience. But he tasted the sharp fruits of the quick bridle wrench which had freed him from the ostler. It was only for a few minutes that he was alone, but when he came to a halt in the high plaster-walled hall, with the rusting helmet above him, and far above the helmet the dim mysterious balconies, he had already dulled his sudden itch for rebellion. Small though he looked on the grey, there was something commanding in the confident air with which he sat the saddle. Something impressive in his childish frame, as though there was a kind of weight there, or strength, a compound of spirit and matter, something solid that underlay the whims, terrors, tears, and laughter and vitality of his 7 years. By no means good-looking, he had nevertheless this presence. Like his mother, there was a certain scale about him, as though his height and breadth bore no relation to the logic of feet and inches. The ostler entered the hall, slow, shuffling, hissing gently, a perpetual habit of his, whether grooming a horse or not, and the grey pony was at once led away in the direction of the schoolrooms to the west. Titus watched the back of the ostler's head as he was led along, but said nothing. It was as though what had just occurred was something they had rehearsed many times before, and that there was no need for comment. The child had known this man and his hissing, which were as inseparable as a rough sea from the sound that it makes, for little more than a year, when the grey was given him at a ceremony known as the pony giving, a ceremony that took place without fail on the 3rd Friday after the 6th birthday of any son of the line, who was also, by reason of his father's death, an earl in his minority. But for all this length of time, and 15 months was a considerable span for a child who could only remember with any distinctness his last 4 years, the ostler and Titus had exchanged not more than a dozen sentences. It was not that they disliked one another, the ostler merely preferring to give the boy pieces of stolen seed cake to making any effort at conversation, and Titus was quite content to have it so, for the ostler was to him simply the shuffling figure who took care of his pony, and it was enough to know his mannerisms, the way his feet shuffled, the white scar above his eye, and to hear him hissing. Within an hour the morning classes were under way. At an ink-stained desk, with his chin cupped in his hands, Titus was contemplating, as in a dream, the chalk marks on the blackboard. They represented a sum in short division, but might as well have been some hieroglyphic message from a moon-struck prophet to his lost tribe 1,000 years ago. His mind, and the minds of his small companions in that leather-walled schoolroom, was far away, but in a world not of prophets, but of swapped marbles, birds' eggs, wooden daggers, secrets and catapults, midnight feasts, heroes, deadly rivalries, and desperate friendships.